My name is Olivia Carter. I am 68 years old, a widow, and for most of my life I have been the quiet guardian of my family's estate here in Charleston, South Carolina. $20 million in properties, shares, and a little embroidery shop that has been in my family for generations. These were not just numbers to me, but pieces of a life built with my late husband's devotion and my own persistence. I believed my children would one day understand that this wealth was less about money and more about legacy. I was wrong. It began on an ordinary evening when my temples throbbed with a stubborn headache. Daniel, my eldest, had left his briefcase in the hallway outside his study. I thought nothing of it as I stepped into his room to look for some aspirin. The desk lamp cast a faint glow across scattered papers, receipts, and half-read law journals. When I brushed against the leather briefcase, its clasp gave way, and something slipped to the floor. A folded sheet of paper stared back at me. I bent down, thinking it was another routine legal note. But when I unfolded it, my breath caught in my throat. The handwriting was sharp, deliberate. Edward Collins, Daniel's longtime colleague, and the words were chilling. If she resists, cut her out. In that instant, my world tilted. This was no affectionate reminder or business memo. It was a plan to erase me, to strip me from the trust my husband and I had built, to sever me from the very estate that bore my name. Inside my son's briefcase lay not only a note, but a threat to everything I had carried forward after my husband's death. I froze, my fingers trembling around the page. My mind screamed questions. How long had Daniel been scheming? Why would he conspire with Edward against his own mother? And most haunting of all, what did cut her out truly mean? Was it only my share of the estate, or was it something darker, something that could not be undone? I folded the note carefully and slid it back where it came from. My pulse hammered as though every beat could give me away. From that moment, I knew I could not confront Daniel head-on. Not yet. My strength had to remain invisible, my resolve cloaked in silence. If you are listening to me now, let me pause for a breath and share something with you. Stories like mine are not just stories. They are warnings, reminders, and sometimes sparks of courage for someone else who is watching quietly from the shadows of their own life. If what you hear resonates, I hope you will stay with me until the end, and perhaps even share this journey with someone who needs it. It would mean more than you know. I closed the briefcase and left his study, every step deliberate, every motion rehearsed in my mind as if I had been caught in the act. But no one stopped me. The house was silent save for the creak of old floorboards and the distant hum of Charleston's night air through the shutters. I returned to my bedroom and sat on the edge of the bed, the silver necklace around my neck cold against my skin. It was a necklace my husband had given me years ago, a reminder of his faith in me, of promises once whispered under softer circumstances. That night it felt heavier than ever, as though he were still here, urging me to stay steady. My thoughts drifted back to Daniel. He had always been ambitious, clever, determined to rise faster than anyone else around him. I used to admire those qualities. They reminded me of his father's persistence in business negotiations. But where my husband's determination had been grounded in honor, Daniel's now seemed sharpened by greed. I thought of my daughter Lily, too, and the distance that had grown between us. Misunderstandings about money had carved a canyon between mother and daughter. She thought I favored Daniel, that I trusted him more. If only she knew what I had just seen, how I had just discovered the depths of his betrayal. The night wore on. Sleep eluded me. I kept seeing that line over and over, etched into my mind like a scar. If she resists, cut her out. The words followed me into the kitchen where I poured a glass of water, into the hallway where portraits of ancestors seemed to stare with silent judgment, and back into my bedroom where the shadows felt too deep to breathe. It would have been easier to confront Daniel then and there, to storm into his room and demand the truth. But instinct told me otherwise. If he had already plotted with Edward, then he had already prepared for resistance. And if I showed my hand too soon, I would lose every chance of defending not only myself, but the future of what my husband and I had built. So I chose silence. My silence was not weakness. It was the stillness of a bowstring pulled back, waiting for the right moment. I decided I would watch. I would listen. I would follow every trace Daniel left behind, and I would gather what I needed without his knowledge. That night, I unlocked the small wooden box I kept in my closet. It held old letters from my husband, receipts from the shop, photographs from when the children were small. I placed a fresh notebook inside my new journal where I would record every detail. It would be my shield, my silent companion, my way of keeping sanity while I pieced together the puzzle of betrayal. I looked once more at the necklace before lying down, its chain pressed into my collarbone, grounding me in a world that was about to unravel. I whispered into the darkness, half to my husband and half to myself, I will not let them cut me out. And with that vow, the first seed of my plan was planted. A plan to stay silent, to endure, and to prepare for the day when the truth would no longer tremble in my hands, but in his. When the dawn finally broke, I was still awake. The light slipped through the lace curtains of my bedroom, softening the edges of the night's revelations, but nothing could soften the weight in my chest. I walked to the dresser and touched the silver necklace at my throat. Its pendant had dulled with time, but to me it gleamed with memories. My husband had given it to me on our 25th anniversary. I could still remember the way he clasped it around my neck, whispering that no matter what storms came, he believed in me. That necklace became more than jewelry. It was a lifeline. I found myself reaching not only for the necklace, but also for the ring of keys that hung by the kitchen door. They were old, each key worn differently. One for the embroidery shop my mother once ran, one for the safe in my study, one for a chest that held family records. These small objects tethered me to the generations before me. They reminded me that my life and the fortune we had built was not simply currency. It was trust, handed down, thread by thread, key by key. Sitting by the kitchen table, I let my thoughts drift backward. I could almost hear my husband's laughter echoing through the house, the way he used to read aloud the financial pages while I cooked supper. When illness claimed him, I thought I would never again feel steady ground beneath me. Yet I found strength in carrying on. I managed the estate, balanced the accounts, and kept the shop open, not because I needed the money, but because I wanted my children to see resilience. But Daniel, he had always been restless, unsatisfied with steady things. I remembered the night he told me, with impatience in his voice, "Mom, this estate needs someone who knows how to use it, not just keep it locked away." At the time, I brushed it off as youthful arrogance. Now, paired with the note from his briefcase, those words returned like a blade twisting deeper. My daughter, Lily, was different. Gentle, artistic, and often lost in colors and canvases, she never cared much for ledgers and balance sheets. We used to be close. She would spend afternoons in the shop, sketching designs while I embroidered initials onto handkerchiefs. But when she grew older, misunderstandings about money created a gulf between us. She thought I gave too much attention to Daniel, too much trust to his career. I suppose in my attempt to hold the family together, I only made her feel unseen. I wish I could have explained to her that my caution with her was not lack of faith, but fear. Fear that the estate's weight would crush her gentle spirit. And so she withdrew. Our conversations dwindled to polite exchanges. Her visits became rare. Each silence between us felt like another stone in a wall I never meant to build. I stirred my tea absent-mindedly, the spoon tapping against porcelain, and allowed the past to wash over me. My husband's letters, still tucked away in that wooden box, came to mind. He often wrote of trust, Not the legal kind, but the kind that binds people together. Money is only the shadow, one of his notes had said. Character is the substance. Teach them that, Olivia? Had I failed in that teaching? Had Daniel misunderstood every lesson, twisting it into ambition rather than honor? And had Lily misunderstood me, believing I measured her worth by what she could manage rather than who she was? I rose and wandered through the house. In the hallway hung our wedding portrait, his hand resting over mine, both of us too young to imagine the trials ahead. In the living room, the clock ticked steadily, the same one that had marked hours of joy and grief. These walls had seen laughter, arguments, lullabies, and long nights of illness. They had also seen promises I was determined not to let my son break, no matter how carefully he tried to rewrite them. Later that afternoon, I drove to the embroidery shop. The bell above the door jingled as I stepped inside. The air smelled of fabric, lavender polish, and faint cedar from the old wooden drawers. I touched the counter, the same place where my mother once wrapped finished pieces for customers. I thought of how she used to say, "Every stitch carries a story." Perhaps that was why I could never sell the shop, even though larger businesses towered around us now. It was the soul of our family, preserved in thread and cloth. I unlocked the back cabinet with one of my old keys. Inside were ledgers dating back decades, some written in my mother's careful script. I traced my fingers over the ink, the numbers precise and steady. Here was proof of endurance, of faith carried forward. I closed the cabinet and locked it again, feeling as though I had secured something far greater than money. Driving home, I replayed Daniel's old words once more. This estate needs someone who knows how to use it. Perhaps he saw himself as that person, someone who could twist tradition into profit, but he was blind to the truth, that this estate was not his to reinvent at my expense. When I parked the car and entered the house, twilight had already settled. I turned on the lamp in my study and sat at the desk. My notebook lay open, the first page already filled with the details from the night before. I added another entry, this time about memory. The necklace, the keys, the voices of the past. These would become my anchors as I prepared for the storm ahead. I looked again at the necklace in the mirror, glinting faintly against my collarbone. I whispered into the stillness, "I haven't forgotten you." Whether I meant my husband, my daughter, or even the promise I had made to myself, I wasn't entirely sure. But I knew that remembering would be my first act of resistance. In the silence of that evening, I felt a shift. The past was no longer a weight pressing me down. It was a foundation beneath me, steady and unyielding. And with it, I could face whatever was coming. The days that followed pressed on me with a strange heaviness. Every ordinary sound in the house seemed charged with new meaning. The slam of a door, the hum of the refrigerator, the soft thud of Daniel's footsteps on the stairs. I found myself listening differently, noticing rhythms that once slipped past me. It was as if that single note from his briefcase had sharpened my senses, tuning me into secrets I had not dared to hear before. Daniel had always been meticulous, the kind of man who color-coded his files and polished his shoes until they shone. But now, cracks appeared in his polished veneer. He took calls at odd hours, his voice hushed behind the closed door of his study. He left early some mornings, claiming court appearances in nearby towns, yet the court schedules published in the paper did not match. And most telling of all, his eyes flickered with something unfamiliar when they met mine, an impatience, an edge, as if I had suddenly become an obstacle rather than a mother. I began to keep my own record. In the small notebook hidden in my wooden box, I logged times, dates, snippets of overheard conversations. It was not the behavior of a suspicious woman, I told myself, but of a survivor. If he had already drawn a line in the sand with that note, Then I would prepare my defense on paper, one entry at a time. One evening, as I carried laundry past his room, I paused at the faint murmur of voices. Daniel was not alone. Through the thin crack of the door, I caught fragments: transfer, beneficiary, amendments. My pulse quickened. I hurried away before he could sense me lingering, but the words burned themselves into my mind. Later that night, I wrote them down carefully, circling each one as though encircling evidence in a trial. At breakfast the next morning, he sat across from me, buttering his toast with his usual calm. "You should think about selling the embroidery shop, Mom," he said casually, as though discussing the weather. I kept my voice steady. "That shop carries our family's name. It isn't something to be traded for convenience." He smiled, but it was a smile with no warmth. Sometimes sentiment costs more than it's worth. I stirred my coffee, letting the silence hang between us. He thought he was being clever, planting seeds of doubt in my mind, but he underestimated me. I had lived long enough to recognize when someone was rehearsing a plan and his performance was growing careless. Later that week, as I sorted mail stacked on the hall table, an envelope addressed to Daniel caught my eye. It bore the name of a law office in Atlanta. My stomach tightened. Daniel had no official cases there. His work was centered firmly in Charleston. I memorized the firm's name before placing the envelope back, untouched. That evening, I wrote it in my notebook, underlining it twice. At night, when the house was quiet, I found myself pacing. I replayed his patterns, every unexplained absence, every hushed call, every envelope I had glimpsed. The pieces had not yet formed a picture, but the outline was becoming clearer. He was planning something larger than a disagreement over inheritance. He was weaving a net around me, and he thought I was too blind to notice. The silver necklace lay against my collarbone as I paced, its weight a reminder that I had faced darker nights before. When my husband was ill, I had learned to sleep in increments, to rest between hospital alarms and whispered consultations with doctors. This vigilance was different, but the discipline was the same. Watch, listen, endure. I also thought often of Lily during those restless nights. I wondered if she sensed any of this, if her distance from me had left her unaware of the storm brewing under our roof. I longed to reach out to her, but pride and hesitation held me back. I feared she would not believe me, or worse, that she would think I was inventing shadows to excuse my mistrust of Daniel. So I remained silent, holding the truth inside until I could shape it into something undeniable. One afternoon, I sat by the front window as Daniel returned home. He walked briskly from his car, a folder tucked tightly under his arm. For a fleeting moment, I saw the boy he had once been, the child who brought me seashells from the shore, the teenager who stayed up late studying for law school exams. But the man crossing the lawn now was no longer that boy. His ambition had hardened into something cold, and I could not ignore it any longer. I opened my notebook that evening and wrote a single line beneath the day's date. My son is no longer just my son. He is becoming my adversary. The words ached as I wrote them, but they were true, and the truth, however painful, would become my compass. That night, I placed the notebook back into the wooden box and locked it with the same old key my mother once used for the shop's cabinets. The act felt ceremonial, as though each click of the lock sealed not only the evidence, but also my determination. The house settled into its familiar creaks and sighs, but I no longer felt lulled by them. Every sound was now a signal, every silence a warning. I knew I could not yet see the whole design of Daniel's plan, but I had seen enough to understand that I had stepped into a battle. One fought not with shouts or fists, but with patience, memory, and quiet strength. And I intended to win. I reached a point where silence felt too heavy to bear alone. Keeping a secret can protect you, but it can also hollow you out from the inside. The words of that note, the strange calls, the envelope from Atlanta, They swirled in my mind like storm clouds refusing to break. I needed a place to release them before they consumed me, and so I thought of Nora Bennett. Nora had been my friend since childhood. We grew up on the same block, played hopscotch on the same cracked sidewalks, and later held each other's hands through weddings, births, and funerals. Life had pulled us onto different paths, but the bond remained unbroken. Nora ran a small bookshop on King Street, a cozy space that smelled of paper, cedar shelves, and cinnamon tea. People came there not just for novels, but for solace. I knew if there was anyone I could trust, it was her. One afternoon, I walked into her shop, the bell chiming softly above the door. She looked up from the counter, her glasses perched low on her nose, and her face lit with recognition. "Olivia Carter," she said warmly, coming around to embrace me. "It's been too long." Her hug steadied me in ways I hadn't realized I needed. We settled at a small table tucked in the back, the kind reserved for quiet conversations. Books towered around us, creating a cocoon of stories, but none felt as fragile as the one I was about to tell. At first, I hesitated. The words clung to my throat. To speak them aloud meant they would become real, and reality was far more frightening than suspicion. But Nora waited patiently, her hands folded, her eyes filled with the same gentleness I remembered from years ago. "I found something," I finally whispered. "Something in Daniel's briefcase." Her brow furrowed. "What sort of something?" I reached into my purse and pulled out a folded piece of paper. I hadn't wanted to carry it, but leaving it at home felt riskier. I placed it on the table between us. She adjusted her glasses and read. When her eyes met mine again, they were wide with disbelief. "Good Lord, Olivia, what does this mean?" "It means," I said slowly, "that my own son is plotting to erase me, to take everything his father and I built, everything I have guarded for decades. And he's not alone. Edward Collins is involved. They're building a plan to change the trust." Nora leaned back, her lips pressed into a thin line. For a moment, she said nothing, as though weighing every possibility. Finally, she spoke. "You can't fight this alone. If Daniel and Edward are already moving pieces, you need someone who knows the law better than they do." I thought about that, I admitted, but who could I trust? Lawyers are their world. She reached across the table and placed her hand over mine. "There's one I know. His name is Victor Hale. He's not like the others. He's fought cases against corporate fraud, stood his ground even when it cost him clients. He won't be swayed by bribes or pressure. If anyone can help you navigate this, it's him." I looked at her, searching for any doubt, but Nora's gaze was steady. Still, fear clung to me. If I go to him, it becomes a war. Am I ready for that? Nora squeezed my hand. "You don't have to think of it as war. Think of it as protection. You're not striking first, Olivia. You're shielding what's already yours." Her words slipped into the cracks of my uncertainty like balm. For weeks I had been moving in silence, my every thought turned inward. To speak it aloud, to have someone else bear witness, shifted the weight. I wasn't crazy. I wasn't imagining shadows. There was real danger, and now someone else could see it too. We sat for a long while after that, sipping tea as the afternoon light faded through the shop windows. Customers came and went, their chatter a distant hum. For me, the world had narrowed to that table, to Nora's reassuring presence and the folded piece of paper between us. Before I left, Nora hugged me again. "You're stronger than you know," she whispered, "but even the strong need allies." "Promise me you'll meet Victor," I promised, though my heart still fluttered with unease. Walking back through the streets of Charleston, I felt the air thick with the scent of magnolia and salt from the harbor. The city bustled with its usual rhythm, but I carried a secret rhythm of my own, each step toward truth, each breath closer to revelation. For the first time since finding that note, I did not feel entirely alone. That night, in the quiet of my room, I placed the silver necklace on my nightstand before lying down. It caught the glow of the lamp, gleaming like a beacon. I thought of my husband's steady voice, of the promises we made, of the children we raised. Daniel's betrayal had cut me, but Nora's faith had reminded me not all bonds were broken. Some still held. I opened my notebook and wrote, "Today I told someone. Today I was believed." The ink bled slightly into the page, but the words stood firm. For the first time, my silence had found an echo. As I closed the book, I felt a flicker of something I hadn't dared hope for, the faint stirrings of hope. I waited for the right moment, biding my time the way a patient seamstress waits for the perfect stitch to pull a pattern together. The note still haunted me, and Nora's words echoed in my ears. I needed allies, but first I needed proof no one could dispute. If Daniel and Edward were plotting in the shadows, then the shadows would become my vantage point. It happened on a Wednesday afternoon. Daniel had mentioned he was meeting a client, but his tone was too careful, too rehearsed. My instincts, sharpened by weeks of quiet observation, told me otherwise. I slipped into my car a few minutes after he left, staying far enough behind so he wouldn't notice. Charleston streets were familiar to me, yet that day they felt like the corridors of a labyrinth, drawing me toward a truth I had tried not to name. He parked near a cafe tucked on a side street, the kind of place with mismatched chairs and wide windows fogged by steam from coffee cups. I found a spot across the street, angled so I could see without being seen. My hands tightened on the steering wheel when another figure appeared. Edward Collins, his colleague, the same hand that had penned the words that still burned in my memory. They greeted each other with the ease of long-time conspirators. I watched as they settled into a corner booth, Daniel sliding a small USB drive across the table. Edward picked it up quickly, slipping it into his pocket before producing a plain envelope of his own. The gesture was smooth, practiced, as though they had done this before. I forced myself to breathe slowly. My phone felt heavy in my hand, but I steadied it and lifted the camera just enough to capture the exchange through the window. The lens clicked softly, each photograph a lifeline, proof I could hold on to when words might be dismissed. I shifted in my seat, careful not to draw attention. Their conversation was muffled by glass and street noise, but every so often the sounds carried across. I caught fragments. Trust amendment, beneficiary change, Cayman account. The words struck me like stones, confirming what I already feared. They weren't merely talking in hypotheticals. They were moving pieces on a board designed to push me out. The silver necklace around my neck felt suddenly cold, as though my husband himself were urging me not to look away. I pressed my hand to it, steadying myself. The shop, the estate, the inheritance, it was all in jeopardy, and not from strangers, but from my own flesh and blood. Inside the cafe, Daniel leaned forward, his gestures sharp, insistent. Edward scribbled notes on a pad, his pen scratching across paper with a kind of urgency that made my stomach tighten. I imagined the words they were writing, clauses, signatures, dates, legal daggers aimed at me. I snapped another photo, then another, documenting every angle I could. My hands trembled, but I would not let them fail me. Silence had been my shield, now it became my weapon. When they stood to leave, I ducked low in my seat, heart hammering. They walked together down the street, Daniel slipping the envelope into his briefcase, Edward checking his watch as though on a schedule. Only when their figures disappeared into the crowd did I allow myself to exhale. Driving home, the city blurred around me. Every church steeple, every wrought iron gate seemed to watch as I passed. By the time I reached the house, I felt both stronger and more broken. Stronger because I now had evidence. Broken because it was my own son I had followed like a criminal. That evening, I sat at my desk with the photos spread before me. Each image was a wound and a warning, but also a promise. I wrote down every detail: the time, the cafe's name, the words I had overheard. My notebook was filling quickly, each page another thread in the net I would one day cast. When Daniel returned later that night, he moved through the house with his usual calm, greeting me with a smile that no longer fooled me. I answered quietly, meeting his gaze long enough to remind myself that I was not powerless. He did not know I had seen. He did not know I had listened, and that ignorance was my advantage. I locked the photos and notes in the wooden box, placing the key back on its ring. The weight of it in my hand was both heavy and reassuring. My mother's keychain, once used to guard the embroidery shop, had now become the guardian of my truth. As I prepared for bed, the words I had overheard echoed in the stillness. Trust amendment. Cayman account. They sounded foreign and cold, yet they were now part of my reality. I understood that the battle ahead would not be fought in shouts or slammed doors. It would be fought in documents, affidavits, and courtroom shadows. And I was ready. The following week, I decided to follow Daniel again. By then, the photographs and notes I had collected already painted a troubling picture. But I sensed there was more beneath the surface. If the cafe meeting had confirmed his financial schemes, I needed to understand the personal motives driving him. Why was he willing to carve his own mother out of everything? What was he chasing that was worth such betrayal? That morning, he left home dressed more carefully than usual, his tie knotted with precision, his hair slicked back as if he were meeting someone he needed to impress. He drove past his office without stopping. An instinct told me to keep going. The road stretched farther than his usual routes until he reached Atlanta, nearly 5 hours away. I stayed back, cautious not to draw attention, and when he finally pulled into a quiet neighborhood lined with magnolia trees, I slowed my car and parked at a discreet distance. Daniel walked up the steps of a modest brick townhouse. The door opened and a young woman greeted him. She had long brown hair, her posture graceful, her smile intimate in a way that made my stomach twist. He leaned in to kiss her cheek before stepping inside. I sat frozen, my fingers gripping the steering wheel so tightly that my knuckles ached. I waited. An hour passed, then another. Finally, I gathered the courage to leave my car and walk toward the house. My heart pounded with every step, and I half feared someone would see me, but I needed to know who she was. Through the lace curtains of the front window, I caught a glimpse. Daniel seated comfortably, his jacket off, his tie loosened. The woman sat beside him, her hand resting on the curve of her belly. It was not just a casual touch. She was pregnant. I stumbled back from the window, my breath catching in my throat. The revelation cut deeper than any legal betrayal. My son was building another life, another family, and he was using the promise of my estate to pave the way. Suddenly, his ruthless determination made sense. He was not only trying to seize money, he was trying to erase me to fund a future that excluded me entirely. As I stood there, hidden by the hedges, I noticed a framed certificate on the wall behind them, visible through the glass. A prenatal certificate with Daniel's name scribbled faintly in the corner. The truth hit me like a wave. I was watching the reason for his urgency, his desperation, and his cruelty. I hurried back to my car, my body trembling, and sat in silence for several minutes. The betrayal now carried flesh and bone, a child who would never know the grandmother whose sacrifices had made this possible. My hands shook as I jotted notes in my journal, careful to capture the details while the image was fresh. The woman, the child, the certificate, Daniel's easy, comfort in a life he had hidden from us all. I drove home in silence, the miles stretching endlessly. The silver necklace pressed against my skin, colder than ever, as though my husband's memory demanded I confront the truth head on. The embroidery shop keys clinked softly in my purse, grounding me with their familiar weight. I was not imagining shadows anymore. I was staring directly into the heart of them. That night, Daniel returned late. He moved around the kitchen casually, pouring himself a glass of water, unaware that I had followed him, unaware that I had seen the secret life he had tried so hard to hide. He asked me how my day had been, his tone neutral, his expression unreadable. I answered calmly, my face composed, my voice steady. If he suspected, I gave nothing away. But inside, my resolve hardened. This was no longer only about money. This was about legacy, about respect, about refusing to let deceit build the foundation for a future I would never bless. If Daniel believed he could erase me to create his new family's fortune, he had underestimated the quiet strength of the woman who had raised him. Later, alone in my room, I placed the necklace carefully in its box and whispered into the silence, "You were right. The storm is here." The words were for my husband, for myself, for the echo of promises once made. Then I opened my notebook and wrote another entry. He has another woman. She is carrying his child. The estate is their target. I closed the book, locked it away with my keys, and sat for a long time in the dark. The betrayal was complete, but so was my determination. If Daniel thought this would break me, he had forgotten who I was. I met Victor Hale in his office on a rainy afternoon. The steady patter against the windows filled the silence between us as he studied the notes and photographs I had brought. He was a man of measured presence, his salt and pepper hair cropped neatly, his suit worn but impeccable. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the calm authority of someone who had navigated storms like mine before. "Your instincts were right, Mrs. Carter," he said, tapping the photograph of Daniel and Edward at the cafe. "This isn't just talk. They're orchestrating something deliberate, and it's not just betrayal of trust, it's financial crime." I sat straighter, clutching the edge of my chair. I knew they were planning to cut me out. But how? Victor leaned forward, folding his hands. "The language I hear in your notes, trust amendment, beneficiary change, Cayman account, it all points to a strategy. A revocable trust can be amended while you're alive. What Daniel and Edward want is to rewrite it, to make him the sole beneficiary. And if they've forged or manipulated your power of attorney, they could execute those changes without your consent." The words stung, even though I had braced myself for them. "And the Cayman accounts? They're likely setting up offshore holdings," he explained. "Money can be funneled there with little oversight. Once it's gone, it's nearly impossible to trace back. It's a classic tactic for hiding assets. If they succeed, even the courts might struggle to untangle it." I pressed my hand against the silver necklace at my throat. "So what can I do?" Victor's gaze was steady. "You need evidence. Tangible. Irrefutable. Emails, contracts, financial transfers. Witnesses, if possible. Once we have that, I can file an affidavit and move to freeze any suspicious activity. But until then, you must be cautious. If Daniel suspects you know too much, he'll accelerate his plan." I swallowed hard. The room felt smaller, the rain louder. He's my son, Victor. I keep asking myself, how did we come to this? How can I fight him without destroying what little bond we have left? The lawyer's face softened. "You're not the one destroying it, Mrs. Carter." "He is. You're protecting what's rightfully yours and what your late husband intended for you. That doesn't make you cruel. It makes you just—" The words steadied me more than I expected. I nodded slowly. "I'll do what needs to be done." Victor picked up his pen. "I want you to meet someone who can help. An investigator with the Department of Justice, Financial Crimes Division. His name is Agent Carlson. If Daniel is laundering money through offshore accounts, Carlson's expertise will be invaluable." The following day, I found myself sitting across from Agent Carlson in a government office. He was younger than Victor, with sharp eyes that missed nothing and a voice that carried both authority and urgency. He listened as I recounted everything: the note, the photographs, the woman in Atlanta, the prenatal certificate. His expression never wavered. When I finished, he leaned back and crossed his arms. "Mrs. Carter, I've seen schemes like this before." They always start with someone believing they're smarter than the system. Offshore accounts, fake amendments, shell corporations, it's a pattern. The danger is, once money starts moving, it vanishes fast. If you hesitate, you could lose not just your estate, but your ability to challenge the fraud. A chill swept through me. So what you're saying is, if I make one wrong move, everything could be gone. He nodded. Exactly. If you sign anything without full understanding, or if they get access to certain documents, you could be locked out permanently. You have to stay vigilant, and you have to let us guide you. I tighten my grip on the keys in my purse. Then I'll gather what you need. Documents, emails, whatever it takes, Victor added. We'll help you authenticate every piece. What you've already captured is strong, but we need more to secure a case. For the first time in weeks, I felt less alone. I had Nora's encouragement, Victor's legal mind, and Carlson's investigative power. Together, they formed a wall between Daniel's ambition and my silence. That evening, back at home, Daniel moved around the kitchen as if nothing had changed. He asked about groceries, about the embroidery shop, even offered to fix a loose shutter on the porch. His charm was steady, but now it rang hollow. Behind his smile, I saw the calculations, the schemes, the ruthless determination to erase me. I returned his questions with calm answers, my expression unreadable. He didn't know I had begun to gather allies. He didn't know that every false smile only fueled my resolve. Later, in the quiet of my room, I opened my notebook and wrote, "They want to amend the trust. They want to forge power of attorney, offshore accounts in Cayman. Victor and Carlson will help me stop them. I must act carefully. One wrong step, and they win." I closed the book, placed it in the wooden box, and locked it again. The silver necklace lay cool against my skin, a reminder that my husband's faith in me was not misplaced. As I turned off the lamp, Carlson's warning echoed in the dark. If I was careless, they could strip me of everything, but I would not let that happen. My silence was no longer only a shield, it was strategy, and patience would be my greatest weapon. The weight of Agent Carlson's warning stayed with me. Every time I touched the silver necklace at my throat, I felt it pressing me forward. Silence would no longer be enough. Silence had to become action. If Daniel and Edward were laying out documents to erase me, then I needed to gather my own papers, my own truths, and lock them so tightly in my keeping that no one could deny them. I began with Daniel's study. He often left before dawn, chasing meetings or court appearances, and in those hours the house was mine. I moved quietly, careful not to disturb the order of his papers so that he would not sense my presence. His desk drawers smelled faintly of cedar and ink, and within them I found contracts, memos, and receipts. I sorted through them quickly, copying anything that bore the faintest shadow of deceit. My small portable scanner hummed softly, its light passing across signatures and seals. One folder contained drafts of amendments to the trust, language altered, clauses reshaped, my name crossed out in precise strokes. My hands shook as I fed each page into the scanner, but I did not stop. I knew Victor would need these to prove the pattern. In another drawer, I uncovered a thin envelope filled with invoices from a law office in Atlanta. Each bill was addressed to Daniel, with references to asset restructuring and beneficiary transfer. The dates matched the weeks he had been absent. I copied them all and slid the originals back exactly where I had found them. The most painful discovery came in the bottom drawer. Tucked between contracts was a series of letters, written in Daniel's own hand, addressed to the young woman I had seen in Atlanta. He wrote of new beginnings, of a family waiting to be born, of a life they would build together with security he promised was guaranteed. The implication was clear. He was counting on my estate to finance it all. I copied the letters and returned them, my chest tightening, as if every word were a blade. By the time the sun rose, I had hidden the copies in a wooden box lined with velvet, the same one that once held my wedding veil. That box, once a container of love, was now a container of betrayal. I locked it with the old key from the embroidery shop, the same key that had safeguarded my mother's ledgers years ago. The symbolism was not lost on me. What once preserved tradition would now preserve truth. Still, I knew these pieces alone might not be enough. Carlson had warned that electronic records could reveal the real depth of Daniel's plan. That evening, I waited until Daniel went out, his briefcase in hand, his steps brisk with purpose. The house grew still. I entered his study again and powered on his computer. The screen glowed with familiar icons, but when I typed his old password, the letters refused me. Access denied. A chill moved through me. He had changed it. He suspected someone might pry. Perhaps he had noticed something moved, or perhaps his paranoia matched my own. Either way, the lock screen glared back at me like a silent warning. He knew the walls were closing in. I sat there for a long moment, staring at the unyielding password prompt. My heart pounded with frustration, but also with resolve. If he thought a password could keep me out, he underestimated me. I didn't need to break into his machine myself. Victor and Carlson would know how to subpoena records, how to uncover encrypted trails. My task was simpler, to hold what I already had and to keep gathering from the spaces he thought too ordinary to conceal. Before leaving the study, I returned everything to its place, smoothing each folder and straightening each stack. Daniel's trust in his own cleverness was his blind spot. He thought he was hiding well. He didn't see the quiet woman watching, memorizing, preserving. That night, as I sat in my bedroom with the wooden box beside me, I thought of Lily. She had always hated secrets, always begged for openness in a house that too often preferred silence. I wondered if she could forgive me for keeping this from her now, but until I had every piece in order, until I could place undeniable truth in her hands, I could not risk it. I wrote in my notebook, "Trust amendments drafted, Atlanta invoices, love letters to the other woman, computer locked with new password. He suspects, must be cautious, must not falter." The ink bled dark against the paper, heavy with the weight of what I was recording. I closed the notebook, slipped it into the wooden box, and turned the key. The house was silent, but in that silence I felt my husband's presence. I touched the necklace at my throat and whispered, "I'm holding it together. For you, for what we." Built, I lay awake, knowing the storm was still gathering, but I no longer felt powerless. Every copied page, every recorded detail was another thread in the net I would cast. One day, it would close around Daniel and Edward, and when it did, the truth would speak louder than all their schemes. I arrived at Victor's office early, the wooden box pressed tightly against my chest as though it carried not just documents, but the very weight of my life. Inside were the copies I had gathered in secret, the trust amendments, the invoices from Atlanta, the letters Daniel had written to the woman in Atlanta. I had rehearsed the moment in my mind, yet when I finally placed the box on Victor's desk, my hands trembled. He opened it carefully, his eyes narrowing as he sifted through each page. "This," he said quietly, "is more than enough to raise alarms. But to make it undeniable, we'll need to formalize it. You'll need to sign an affidavit swearing to how you obtained them and why I'll sign whatever I need to," I answered, my voice firm even as my stomach turned. Agent Carlson entered moments later, carrying a folder of his own. He laid it beside Victor's box. "We've traced several wire transfers tied to Edward Collins. They connect directly to offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands. It's textbook asset concealment. Combined with these documents, it paints a picture of conspiracy and fraud." The air in the room grew heavy. I forced myself to steady my breathing as Victor slid a paper toward me. "This affidavit declares that you Olivia Carter, discovered these documents within your own household, that you have reason to believe your son and his associate are attempting to alter your trust without consent, and that offshore accounts are being used to siphon assets. My hand shook as I picked up the pen. Signing my name felt like severing something invisible between Daniel and me, as though I had crossed a line from mother to adversary. But I reminded myself, he had chosen this, not me. My pen scratched across the page, sealing my statement in ink. Carlson collected the affidavit with quiet efficiency. We'll move quickly. A petition for a temporary restraining order will be filed by morning. That means Daniel and Edward can be summoned before a judge and barred from executing any changes until the case is heard. I exhaled a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. So soon? Victor nodded. Time is our ally if we act now. From the documents, it looks like they plan to finalize a transfer within days. If we hadn't caught this, by the end of the week, your estate could have been locked away overseas. I touched the silver necklace at my throat, whispering silently to my husband, "We're stopping them." The next hours passed in a blur. Carlson scanned and logged the evidence. Victor drafted filings, and I sat in the corner, watching as my quiet suspicions transformed into legal weapons. It was no longer just my notebook or my trembling observations. It was real, official, stamped with the weight of justice. When I returned home that evening, the house felt unchanged. The same creaking floors, the same portraits on the wall, but I was not the same. I carried the knowledge that wheels were turning beyond Daniel's control. Still, I kept my face calm when he returned. He came in with his usual briefcase, setting it by the door. "Long day, Mom," he said, loosening his tie. "Clients are demanding these days." I smiled faintly, hiding the storm beneath my calm. "I'm sure they are." He never suspected that at that very moment court clerks were stamping papers that would summon him to answer for his schemes. His arrogance blinded him, and my silence shielded me. That night, sleep finally came to me, though restless. I dreamt of the shop's keys, heavy in my palm, and of Lily's face as a little girl painting in the back room. I dreamt of Daniel, too, but not as a boy. In my dream, he stood in a courtroom, his hands empty, his eyes darting like a man who realized too late that his mother had been stronger than he believed. The following morning, Victor called. "It's done," he said. "The judge has signed the restraining order. Daniel and Edward will be served immediately. They're required to appear tomorrow to explain themselves. They won't see it coming." I closed my eyes, relief washing through me like a tide. For weeks, I had felt hunted in my own home, but now the hunt had turned. Tomorrow, Daniel and Edward would walk into court expecting triumph and find themselves summoned to account. As I hung up the phone, I reached for the silver necklace, feeling its cool weight against my skin. My husband's faith lived in its chain, and now it steadied me for what was ahead. I whispered to the quiet room, "We're almost there. The truth is about to step into the light." That evening, as Daniel left the house once more, I watched him from the window. He carried himself with confidence, his briefcase in hand, unaware that inside it lay not the future he believed in, but the evidence of his undoing. And I stood in the shadows, silent, waiting for the moment when he would finally tremble. The morning after the summons, Charleston seemed to breathe differently. News traveled faster than the tides here, carried on whispers across church pews, market stalls, and front porches. By the time I stepped outside to fetch the mail, I could feel the weight of eyes on me, neighbors glancing a little too long before lowering their voices. At the corner grocery, two women lingered by the produce stand. I caught fragments of their conversation. The Carter boy. Schemes with that lawyer friend. Trying to steal from his own mother. Their words floated in the air like nettles. When I walked past, their voices hushed, but their stares lingered. I straightened my shoulders and continued forward, every step deliberate. Later, at the embroidery shop, the same atmosphere followed me. Customers entered quietly, their eyes warm with pity or sharp with judgment. One older man cleared his throat as I finished wrapping his order and said softly, "You're stronger than most would be, Mrs. Carter." His words were kind, but they carried the weight of gossip already spun into stories I had no hand in telling. The church was no refuge either. On Sunday, as the choir's voices rose, I felt a dozen pairs of eyes drift toward me. When the service ended, whispers trailed behind me in the fellowship hall. "Imagine a son turning on his mother like that." Another voice, and a lawyer too, thought he was respectable. The sentences floated like smoke, impossible to grab, impossible to erase. Still, I refused to bow. I wore the silver necklace high and proud, the pendant catching the morning sun as if to remind me that dignity was also armor. I walked through the streets with Nora at my side, her presence like a steadying hand on my back. "Let them whisper," she said firmly as we crossed the market square. "Every whisper is proof they know the truth is not on Daniel's side." At the cafe where Daniel had once met Edward, the barista gave me a free cup of coffee, sliding it across the counter with a quiet nod. It was a small gesture, but I felt the weight of it. Solidarity disguised as kindness. The community was watching, yes, but many were rooting for me too, in their own subtle ways. In the middle of that noise, something unexpected happened. Lily returned. I was at the shop organizing fabrics when the bell above the door chimed. She stood there hesitantly, her hands clasped in front of her, her eyes searching mine with a mixture of guilt and hope. For a moment, I could only stare, remembering the cold silences between us, the misunderstandings that had widened the gap. "Mom," she said softly, "can we talk?" I led her to the back room where we used to spend hours when she was younger, sketching designs while I worked at the embroidery machine. The air smelled of fabric and lavender polish, just as it always had. "I heard," she began, her voice trembling, "people are talking about Daniel, about court, about everything." And I realized I judged you unfairly. I thought you were clinging too tightly to the money, that you didn't trust me enough. But now I see, you were protecting something much deeper. You were protecting us. My throat tightened. For weeks, I had carried the burden of suspicion and betrayal alone. Now, hearing my daughter's voice crack with remorse, I felt something in me loosen. "I never stopped loving you, Lily," I whispered. "I only wanted to shield you from the weight of this estate. I didn't want it to crush your spirit. But I see now that keeping you away only built walls between us." She reached across the table, her hand trembling as it touched mine. "I want to stand with you, Mom. Whatever comes, I'll be there." Tears blurred my vision, but they were not the same tears of fear that had haunted me for weeks. They were tears of release, of a bond being stitched back together. I pressed her hand and felt the warmth of her loyalty return. The whispers outside the shop continued, but for the first time, they didn't pierce me. With Lily by my side, with Nora's steady friendship, I felt fortified. Let them gossip, let them speculate. Truth was already unfolding, and soon it would no longer be whispers in the market, but declarations in court. That evening, as I locked the shop and walked home with Lily, I thought of my husband's words in one of his letters. "Money is only the shadow. Character is the substance." I realized then that I was not only fighting for my estate, I was fighting to ensure that substance triumphed over shadow, that dignity outlasted deceit. At home, Lily lingered in the kitchen with me. We shared a pot of tea, the silver necklace catching the lamplight as I leaned back in my chair. For the first time in a long time, silence between us felt gentle instead of cold. It was the kind of silence that heals, not the kind that divides. I wrote in my notebook before bed, "The town whispers. Daniel is exposed, but Lily has returned. I am not alone anymore. I closed the book, turned the key in the wooden box, and let myself drift into sleep, no longer hollow but whole. The night rain had just ended when I heard the knock. It was late. Too late for neighbors or polite company. The sound echoed through the hall, sharp and hesitant, as though whoever stood on the porch feared being turned away. I wrapped my shawl around my shoulders and opened the door to find her standing there. Marissa Lane, the woman from Atlanta, the woman carrying Daniel's child. She looked nothing like the serene figure I had glimpsed through the window weeks before. Her hair was damp and clinging to her face, her clothes rumpled, her eyes swollen from crying, and her hands, trembling as they pressed against her rounded stomach, revealed the desperation she could no longer conceal. "Mrs. Carter," she whispered, her voice frayed. "Please." I didn't know where else to go. For a moment I stood frozen. My son's betrayal had a face now, a fragile, frightened face at my doorstep. Part of me wanted to turn her away, to close the door on this chapter of deceit, but something in her gaze, pleading, raw, undeniably human, pulled me back from the edge of refusal. "Come inside," I said softly. She stepped into the foyer, dripping water onto the rug, her breath uneven. I guided her into the kitchen, the warm light making her look even more fragile. I set a cup of tea before her, though her hands shook too much to lift it. "I didn't want to hurt you," she blurted, tears spilling over. "When I met Daniel, he told me he was free, that his mother supported him, that everything was secure. I believed him. I never imagined—" Her voice broke. "And then, when I told him about the baby, he promised me everything would be taken care of. But now," she covered her face with her hands, "now he won't even answer my calls." The words landed like stones in my chest. Daniel had not only betrayed me, he had abandoned her too. For weeks I had seen him as ruthless, single-minded, calculating. But hearing her voice tremble, I realized his cruelty extended beyond me. "Why come here?" I asked, my tone calm, though my heart beat heavily. "Because you're the only one left who might listen," she said, lowering her hands. "I know I don't deserve your kindness. But Daniel, he's planning things you don't know about. He has another account, not the Cayman one, a second one, hidden. I saw the transfers before he shut me out. He's preparing to disappear with everything." Her confession tightened the air around us. I leaned back, the silver necklace pressing coolly against my skin as though grounding me. "Do you have proof?" She nodded quickly. "Not much. Just a few emails, some documents I copied before he changed the passwords. I was too scared to keep them at the apartment, so I brought them with me." She pulled a thin folder from her bag and slid it across the table. My fingers hesitated before opening it, but when I did, I saw printed emails, bank statements, routing numbers I didn't understand but knew Victor and Carlson would. The kitchen fell into silence. The ticking clock seemed to mark the gravity of every second. "You can stay here," I said finally, my voice steady. "But this house has rules. You'll take the guest room and you'll work at the shop with me. If you want my trust, you'll earn it. 30 days. If after that time I believe you are sincere, you'll have a place not just here, but in the fight ahead." Her eyes widened. "You'd let me stay? After everything?" I nodded. "Not for you alone, but for the child you carry. That child is innocent. And this estate, this legacy, was built for futures untainted by deceit." She wept again, this time with relief, covering her face as though she couldn't believe what I had said. I reached across the table and placed my hand over hers, not out of forgiveness, but out of resolve. That night, as she settled into the small guest room upstairs, I stood by my window and looked out at the dripping magnolia trees. My husband's absence felt heavy, yet I could almost hear his voice. "Protect what matters, even if it hurts." I touched the necklace at my throat and whispered into the quiet, "The storm grows, but so does my strength." Before I went to bed, I wrote in my notebook, "Marissa has come. Daniel abandoned her. She carries his child. She brought proof of another account. She is frightened, but perhaps she can be an ally. For 30 days, she will live under my roof. If she fails, she leaves. If she proves herself, she stays." I locked the notebook in the wooden box, the key, cool in my palm. Upstairs, I heard floorboards creak as Marissa paced nervously in her room. She was a reminder of Daniel's betrayal, yes, but she was also a chance for redemption, not just for her, but for the future that child represented. As I closed my eyes, I understood something new. This fight was no longer mine alone. Allies would come in unexpected forms, and sometimes even from the very betrayals meant to undo me. The courthouse in Charleston stood like a sentinel of old justice, its white columns rising against the morning sky. On the day of the hearing, I walked up the stone steps with Victor at my side and Agent Carlson just behind. My hands trembled slightly, but the silver necklace at my throat steadied me. I felt its weight as though my husband himself was walking beside me. The hall buzzed with low voices, reporters shifting for better angles, neighbors craning for a glimpse. The whispers that had haunted the market stalls and church pews were now echoing inside these walls. Daniel arrived minutes later, his stride brisk, his suit tailored to perfection. Edward walked beside him, his briefcase clutched like a shield. Daniel's eyes darted toward me, and for a fleeting second I saw the boy he once was, the child who used to run into my arms after school. But the man standing before me was cold, jaw set, every muscle tense with arrogance. He offered no greeting. He didn't need to. The courtroom would host our conversation. Inside, the judge took his seat, and the air shifted to solemn stillness. I sat at the plaintiff's table, my hands folded tightly in my lap, while Victor rose to speak. His voice was measured, calm, carrying authority that filled the room. He laid out the facts, the suspicious amendments to the trust, the invoices from Atlanta, the hidden accounts. Each document I had copied, each photograph I had taken appeared on the screen before the court. Carlson followed, testifying to the transfers traced offshore, the shell accounts, the deliberate concealment. He spoke with clarity, every word striking like a hammer against stone. The courtroom murmured as evidence stacked higher and higher. Then Daniel's counsel rose. A younger man with sharp features, he spoke quickly, trying to drown the truth in a flood of objections and explanations. He argued that I was confused, that my age clouded my understanding, that I had misinterpreted paperwork. He painted me as a fragile widow grasping at shadows. I remained silent, my gaze steady. Victor rose calmly after each objection, dismantling them piece by piece. "The evidence speaks for itself," he said firmly. "This is not imagination. This is intent to defraud." At one point, Edward leaned forward, trying to interrupt Carlson's testimony, but the judge silenced him with a stern glare. The confidence I had seen at the cafe weeks earlier seemed to drain from him, replaced by nervous glances and a sheen of sweat across his brow. Finally, the judge turned to Daniel. "Do you deny attempting to alter your mother's trust without her consent?" Daniel cleared his throat, his voice strained. "I was acting in the best interest of the estate. My mother has no vision for its future." The judge cut him off. "This court does not recognize ambition as justification for fraud. The documents show clear attempts to remove your mother's authority and transfer assets offshore. That is neither best interest nor lawful." The words hung heavy in the room. Daniel's shoulders stiffened, and for the first time I saw fear flicker across his face. The judge delivered the decision firmly. The attempted amendments were null and void. The trust remained intact under my authority, and both Daniel and Edward would face further investigation for fraud and financial misconduct. The gavel struck. sealing the judgment like thunder across the chamber. I sat still, the sound echoing in my chest. The estate was safe, my rights preserved. The storm had not taken me, it had revealed me. Reporters scribbled notes, cameras flashed, but I hardly noticed. I turned my head just enough to meet Daniel's eyes. His face was pale, his hand trembling as he reached for his briefcase. For once, words failed him. He had spoken in plans and schemes for months, but now silence was all he carried. Victor touched my shoulder gently. "It's done," he whispered. I nodded, though my heart was heavy. To win against strangers is one thing. To win against your own son is another wound entirely. Yet beneath the sorrow was strength, a quiet strength I had never felt so clearly. As I left the courthouse, Lily appeared at the steps, her face shining with pride. She slipped her arm through mine, her presence a balm against the ache. "You did it, Mom," she said softly. I smiled faintly, lifting my chin. "No, Lily. We did it, and now we begin again." The crowd parted as we walked down the steps together. For the first time in weeks, the whispers no longer weighed me down. They followed me, yes, but they were whispers of recognition, of respect. My silence had spoken louder than Daniel's ambition ever could. That night, in the quiet of my room, I opened my notebook and wrote, "The court has ruled. The estate is mine to guard. Daniel and Edward are undone. Justice has found its voice." I closed the book, touched the necklace at my throat, and allowed myself a long, steady breath. The storm had broken, but another reckoning still waited, between mother and son. The courthouse emptied slowly, but I lingered, unwilling to rush what felt like the heaviest walk of my life. The judgment had been read, the gavel had struck, and justice was carved into the record. Yet the air around me still carried a weight no decree could lift. When I finally stepped into the corridor, I found Daniel waiting. He leaned against the wall, his briefcase hanging useless at his side. For the first time in years, he looked smaller than the image he tried so hard to project. His eyes darted toward me, searching for something. Mercy, perhaps, or recognition. When they finally settled, I saw what I had not expected: fear. His lips parted, his voice low, shaking as though it fought to hold itself together. "Mom," he whispered, "please, please forgive me." The sound of that word, Mom, struck me like a ghost from another time. It was the word he used as a boy when he scraped his knee, when he sought comfort after a nightmare. But now it carried a hollow ring, stripped of innocence. I stepped closer, my heels echoing against the marble floor. "Forgive you?" I said softly. "You stood ready to erase me. You signed away my life's work. You left me with nothing but silence while you built another family in secret. And now, only now, you tremble." His eyes filled with tears. "I thought I was doing what was right. For my future, for—" His voice broke. "I was wrong. I see it now. Please don't turn your back on me." I shook my head, my hand instinctively finding the silver necklace at my throat. "Daniel, I never turned my back on you. You turned your back on me. Every choice you made carved the distance between us. You chose ambition over loyalty. You chose lies over truth. You chose to abandon the very woman who gave you life." He dropped his briefcase, the papers spilling across the floor like remnants of a broken plan. His hands covered his face, his shoulders shaking with sobs. The image of him kneeling there, undone by his own schemes, was almost too much to bear. Almost. I wanted to reach for him, to cradle him as I once did when the world was cruel and he was small. But my heart knew better. Some wounds are not meant to be soothed in the moment. Some wounds must be left to sting so that lessons can sink into the bone. "Mom, please," he said again, his voice muffled through his hands. "Don't leave me like this." I straightened my back, drawing strength from every scar silence had taught me to bear. "You left me long before this day, Daniel. You made your choice, and now you must live with it." With that, I turned, my steps deliberate, carrying me past him as he crumpled further to the ground. His sobs echoed in the hallway, a haunting rhythm that followed me, but did not break me. For the first time, he trembled not with anger or calculation, but with the truth he could no longer escape. Outside, Lily was waiting. She stood by the courthouse doors, her face pale but resolute. When she saw me, she hurried forward, her arms wrapping tightly around me. I felt her warmth, her forgiveness, her strength flowing into me. "Mom," she said softly, "he'll have to face himself now. But you don't have to carry his choices anymore." I reached into my purse and pulled out the small velvet box I had carried with me since morning. Inside was the silver necklace my husband had once clasped around my neck, the same one that had steadied me through every silent battle. With trembling hands, I placed it into Lily's palm. Her eyes widened. "Mom, this is yours." "No," I said firmly, my voice thick with emotion. "It's ours. But now it belongs with you. You are the one who carries the spirit of what we built, the dignity, the love. This necklace has seen storms and betrayals, but it has also seen endurance. Let it remind you of who we are, of what we do not surrender." Tears welled in her eyes as she clasped it around her neck. The pendant rested against her collarbone, catching the sunlight in a way that made me think of renewal, of cycles closing and opening again. Behind us, through the courthouse windows, I could still hear the muffled sound of Daniel's weeping, but I no longer felt tethered to it. His choices were his burden now. Mine were to protect what remained, to honor the legacy my husband left, and to guide Lily into the light of a future unmarred by deceit. As we walked down the steps together, I felt the whispers of the crowd. Some pitied Daniel, some pitied me, but I no longer cared. My silence had carried me here, my strength had held, and the next chapter was already beginning. That night, in the quiet of my home, I wrote in my notebook one final line about Daniel. He trembled today, but not because of me. He trembled because of the truth. I closed the book, placed it in the wooden box, and turned the key. I sat by the window watching Lily prepare tea in the kitchen, the necklace glinting faintly against her throat. And for the first time in many months, I felt something ease within me. Betrayal had left scars, yes, but renewal had begun. The weeks after the trial unfolded with a strange quiet. The storm that had raged around me, Daniel's plotting, Edward's schemes, the whispers of the town, had broken at last. What remained was the slow work of stitching life back together, like mending a piece of fabric torn in too many places. I knew the scars would always show, but scars have their own kind of strength. I poured myself into the embroidery shop. With Lily now at my side, its rooms seemed to breathe again. She filled the front windows with vibrant displays of her art, blending paintings with embroidered pieces, transforming the store into something more than a business. It became a boutique, a place where tradition met imagination. Customers lingered longer, marveling at her colors and my stitches working together. I saw in her eyes a joy I hadn't seen since she was a child, sketching quietly at the counter. Marissa, too, began to find her place. At first, she moved hesitantly, as though waiting for me to change my mind about letting her stay. But as the days passed, she proved steady, keeping the books with precision, managing orders with care. The 30 days I had promised became more than a trial. They became a turning point. She worked diligently, never asking for sympathy, only showing determination to earn a life better than the one Daniel had promised and abandoned. In the evenings, I would often sit in the back room, the hum of sewing machines filling the air, and watch the two young women, my daughter and the woman who had once been Daniel's secret, working together. It struck me how life can weave unexpected patterns. What began as betrayal had turned into alliance. Out of deception, something new was being born. The child arrived on a crisp autumn morning. I stood beside Marissa in the hospital, her hand gripping mine with a strength that surprised me. When the baby's cry filled the room, I felt tears streaming down my cheeks. I looked at the tiny face, so innocent, untouched by the sins of the father, and I whispered a silent prayer that this child would never repeat Daniel's mistakes. Holding that newborn, I thought of my husband. I imagined him smiling gently, telling me that legacy was not measured only in land or shares, but in the lives we nurture and protect. I kissed the baby's forehead and promised silently to be the kind of grandmother who gave more love than shadows. Back at the house, life began to settle into a rhythm. Mornings at the shop, evenings filled with tea and quiet conversation, weekends where Nora joined us to share books and laughter. The house that had once echoed with suspicion now rang with new voices, softer and warmer. Even the old magnolia trees outside seemed to sway differently, their branches heavy with blossoms as if they, too, believed in second chances. One evening, as I closed the shop, Nora handed me an envelope. "I found this in one of the old shelves at home," she said. "I think it's meant for you." Inside was a letter from my husband, written years ago but never delivered. His handwriting was familiar, steady, filled with the same calm he had carried into every storm. The words were simple, but profound. "Money is only a tool, Olivia. Never let it divide what was meant to bind. Remember that love is the real inheritance, the only thing worth fighting for." I pressed the letter to my chest, my tears falling freely. It was as though he had reached across time to remind me that every choice I had made, the silence, the patience, the fight, had meaning beyond the estate. It was about preserving dignity, about protecting the heart of our family, however fractured it had become. That night, as we all gathered in the kitchen, Lily preparing tea, Marissa rocking the baby, Nora reading a passage from her newest book, I felt a warmth settle over me. The necklace around Lily's neck glinted softly under the light, a symbol that what had once been mine was now hers to carry forward. I thought of Daniel. Somewhere in the city, his ambitions collapsed into silence. I did not hate him. Hate would have poisoned me long ago. Instead, I let sorrow wash through me, then recede, leaving only the quiet hope that one day he might find his own redemption. But whether he did or not, I knew this. My life was not defined by his betrayal. It was defined by the strength to endure, the courage to rebuild, and the grace to let healing blossom where ruin had tried to take root. In the stillness of that evening, as laughter filled the kitchen, I realized I had not just survived. I had built anew, and for the first time in years, I felt whole. I often find myself standing by the window in the early morning, watching the light spill across the magnolia trees. The world feels softer now, though the scars of what is past remain etched inside me. I touch the glass and remember how close I came to being erased, how near I was to losing not only the estate, but the sense of who I am. And yet, as I stand here breathing in the quiet of a new day, I understand that what almost destroyed me has become the very soil where renewal has taken root. The silver necklace no longer rests at my throat. It hangs instead on Lily's, gleaming against her skin when she comes into the shop or sits across from me at the kitchen table. Handing it to her outside the courthouse was not simply a gesture. It was a passing of strength, of trust, of the lesson her father left behind, that love is the only inheritance that outlasts storms. I see her wearing it now, and I know the legacy is safe. There are still nights when I wake and hear echoes of Daniel's voice, see the briefcase on the floor, the paper with its sharp-edged words. If she resists, cut her out. For so long, those words felt like an execution order, the end of all I had built. But now, looking back, I see them differently. That note was not my undoing. It was the beginning. It was the spark that forced me to rise from silence, to claim the strength I had always carried quietly inside. In my notebook, nearly full now, I sometimes read over the early entries. The trembling lines of my handwriting on those first nights tell the story of a woman terrified, doubting herself, clinging to the shadows. But page by page, the words change. They grow firmer, sharper, more resolute. They tell the story of a mother who refused to vanish, who learned that silence could be more powerful than shouting, that patience could pierce ambition, that dignity could outlast deceit. I have thought often of Daniel. My heart aches when I remember the boy he once was, bringing me seashells from the shore, grinning proudly when he passed his exams. Somewhere along the way, he lost himself in the chase for more money, more power, more control. He believed that cutting me out would secure his future, but all it secured was his own downfall. I cannot rewrite his choices, nor can I carry his consequences. I can only hope that the trembling I saw in his eyes outside the courtroom becomes the beginning of his own reckoning, his own chance to remember who he was before ambition turned his heart cold. But Lily, my Lily, she has come back to me. I see her now in the shop, guiding customers with warmth, teaching children art on weekends, her laughter filling the corners where silence once sat heavy. She has become not only my daughter again, but also my partner, my heir in spirit as well as in legacy. When I place the necklace into her hands, I also place the future there, and she has carried it with grace. Marissa, too, has found her place. I watch her cradle her child, rocking gently by the window of the shop, and I feel a strange tenderness. She came to me as a figure of betrayal, a living reminder of Daniel's deceit. Yet she has proven herself, not through words, but through steady action. She has worked tirelessly, cared for her baby with devotion, and shown a humility that has earned my respect. In her, I see not just the scars of Daniel's choices, but the possibility of a future free from his shadow. Sometimes, in the quiet hours after closing the shop, I sit with Nora over tea. She reminds me of the moment I placed that note on her table, my hands shaking, my voice barely above a whisper. She tells me she knew even then that I had the strength to see this through, that silent strength has always been my nature. I smile when she says this, because for the first time, I believe it too. What have I learned from all of this? That storms will come, sometimes from outside, sometimes from those we least expect. But every storm carries within it a seed of renewal. Betrayal can cut deeply, but it can also carve space for healing. Silence can feel like weakness, but when held with patience and clarity, it becomes power. I survived because I remembered who I was, even when others tried to erase me. I endured because I trusted the anchors left behind by my husband, the necklace, the keys, the lessons etched in his letters. And I rebuilt because I chose to see not just ruin, but the chance for something new. As I write these words now, I close my notebook with a sense of finality. The pages will be stored in the wooden box, locked with the same key my mother once used for her ledgers. But before I put it away, I write one last line. Every storm carries a seed of renewal. Mine has bloomed. I place the book inside, turn the key, and let the silence of the house wrap around me. This silence is no longer the sound of fear. It is the sound of peace. The morning sun poured through the lace curtains, casting gentle patterns across the wooden floor. I sat by the window in my favorite chair, needle and thread in hand, the steady rhythm of embroidery carrying me into calm. Each stitch was small, deliberate, yet together they formed something lasting. Just as my life had been, a fabric held together by patience and endurance. The silver threads glimmered in the light, reminding me that beauty is born in persistence. From where I sat, I could see Lily across the street unlocking the shop's door. The The sign above it now read Carter and Lily Boutique, painted in her flowing hand. She arranged the displays in the front windows with quiet joy, mixing her paintings with my embroidery, tradition woven with creativity. I watched her, shoulders straighten with pride, the silver necklace glinting at her throat. My husband's gift had found a new keeper, and I knew it was exactly where it belonged. Inside the shop, Marissa worked at the counter, balancing ledgers with a steadiness that had grown in her over time. Her child cooed from a cradle nearby, tiny hands reaching toward the air as though grasping for a future untouched by deception. Sometimes customers would pause to peek at the baby, smiling at the sight of innocence nestled among spools of fabric and bolts of cloth. I often wondered if that child would ever know the storms that had raged before their birth, or if, by grace, they would only inherit the calm that followed. Nora visited often, her arms filled with books, her laughter filling the corners of the boutique. She read aloud passages she thought might inspire us, her voice carrying wisdom that had weathered decades. The sight of her sitting by the counter with a cup of tea, the baby cradled in her lap, became a picture of community, of friendship that had refused to bend beneath the weight of betrayal. Life in Charleston moved on, as it always does. The market bustled with its usual rhythm, the church bells chimed, and neighbors nodded with respect when they passed me on the street. The whispers had faded, replaced with recognition. They saw not a woman defeated by her son's schemes, but a woman who had endured, who had held her silence until it became strength. Evenings were my favorite. I would sit in the garden as twilight settled, the magnolia trees swaying gently in the breeze, their blossoms heavy with fragrance. Lily would join me, sometimes sketching as the sun dipped low, sometimes simply sitting in companionable silence. Marissa would bring the baby out to the porch, rocking gently while Nora read in the fading light. The house that had once echoed with suspicion now glowed with new voices, new laughter, new hope. One evening, as the stars began to appear, Lily turned to me and asked, "Do you ever regret it, Mom? The fight, the silence, the way things turned out?" I thought for a long moment before answering. Regret? I shook my head. No, pain, yes, but regret? Never. My son planned to take everything I had built, but the step I took left him trembling. Not because I wanted to hurt him, but because I chose not to be erased. That choice gave me back not only the estate, but myself. She nodded, her fingers brushing the necklace at her collarbone. The gesture was quiet, but its meaning was vast. In the days that followed, I found myself writing less in my notebook. The pages were nearly full, the lock on the wooden box closing over them like a seal on a chapter. I no longer needed to document every whisper, every shadow. The truth had been spoken, the estate preserved, and the future secured. What I needed now was not record, but presence. To live, to breathe, to be. On the final page, I wrote one last line. The storm has passed. What remains is the calm of renewal. Then I closed the book, turned the key, and let it rest among the memories of generations before me. As the season shifted, I realized that healing does not arrive all at once. It comes in small moments. The cry of a newborn, the laughter of a daughter returned, the gentle company of an old friend, the quiet hum of a shop alive again. It comes in knowing that betrayal may scar you, but it cannot define you. I sat once more by the window, the embroidery hoop resting in my lap, and looked at the life unfolding around me. The silver necklace glinted on Lily's throat, the baby cooed in Marissa's arms, and Nora's laughter drifted through the air. My husband's voice echoed in memory. Money is only a tool. Love is the real inheritance. And as I pulled the final thread through the fabric, I knew he was right. The storm had carried me to the edge, but it had also delivered me here, to a place of peace, of dignity, of quiet triumph.